Welcome to the 60th A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts. In this six-part lecture series, entitled The 12 Caesars, Images of Power from Ancient Rome to Salvador Dali, Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University examines the continuing engagement throughout history with images of Roman emperors and its impact on Western visual art and culture. In this fifth lecture, entitled Dynasty, Collecting, Classifying, and Connoisseurship, originally delivered at the National Gallery of Art on May 1st, 2011, the esteemed classicist and professor Mary Beard considers the fluid, dynamic, and productive category of emperor groups, which became a popular theme of Western art following the first printing of Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars in 1470.
It's great to see you all again after our break. Uh-oh, I'm too high, Elizabeth says. How about that? It's amazing, we don't have things like this in England. And all I'm supposed to do, but you've already had the advert, is remind you that I shall be signing books after this, just outside. Okay, this is lecture 5. And it's about emperors as a group. Now, one of the funniest satires on Oxford University life is Max Beerbohm's novel Zulika Dobson. First published in 1911, it tells the story of the young, exotically named and stunningly good-looking Zulika, who arrives among the dreaming spires of Oxford to stay with her grandfather, who is the head of the fictional or semi-fictional Judas College. Not only does Zulika herself fall in love for the first time with the young Duke of Dorset, then an undergraduate, but all the male undergraduates, and Oxford was then an almost entirely male university, all the male undergraduates fall in love with her. Literally all of them. And so badly in love that they end up killing themselves for her, every single one of them. At the end of the novel, the unworldly dons seem hardly to have noticed that the students are all dead. Although they are a bit puzzled that the dining room seems a little empty. Meanwhile, on the very, very last page, Zulika is found making inquiries about how best to get to Cambridge, where we think we know what will happen. It's a satire on the dangers of women, but also on the madness of the masculine university world. Now, some of the most engaging characters in the book are the Roman emperors that stand outside the Sheldonian Theatre, designed, as the theatre was, by Sir Christopher Wren as the main place for university ceremonial. The Sheldonian still survives today, much as it was built to Wren's design. But the emperors have been eroded and defaced, partly defaced by undergraduates, I think, and they've actually been replaced twice. The current versions that you see here were carved in the early 1970s. Now, in Zulika Dobson, Beerbohm animates these emperors to make them key observers of the tragicomic events of the novel. In fact, at the very start of the novel, in the extract that you had when you were standing in line, they show that they are all too well aware of the trouble that lies in store. For although Zulika barely gives them a glance as she makes her way to Judas College, the emperors themselves, as one old don notice, break out into a sweat as they watch her. They, at least, Beerbohm continues, foresaw the peril that was overhanging Oxford, and they gave such warning as they could. Let that be remembered to their credit. Let that incline us to think more gently of them. And this prompts him to some more general musings on the fate of these imperial autocrats. In their lives, he goes on, we know they were infamous, some of them, but they have been given their punishment. Quote, here in Oxford, exposed eternally and inexorably to heat and frost, to the four winds that lash them and the rains that wear them away, they are expiating in effigy the abominations of their pride and cruelty and lust. Those who were lechers are now without bodies. Those who were tyrants, they are crowned never but with crowns of snow. Those who made themselves equal to the gods, they are by American visitors, I'm sorry, it does say American visitors, they are by American visitors frequently mistaken for the 12 apostles. To these emperors for whom none weeps, time will give no relief. Surely it is a sign of some grace in them that they did not rejoice in the evil that was to befall the city of their penance. Now, it's a great sort of comic reimagining of Roman emperors, but there is a twist or two in this Beerbohm story. First, on a minor point of math, Beerbohm clearly has in mind here the canonical set of 12 Caesars of Suetonius's Roman biographies, and that's what he claims the American visitors mix up with the 12 apostles. Actually, there are, however, 13 busts. So it's not an easy match either with Suetonius or the apostles. But second, and more significant, there is actually no reason whatsoever to suppose that these figures were originally intended to be emperors at all. Whatever Christopher Wren had in mind in the 17th century, perhaps a group of miscellaneous worthies, more likely a lineup of ancient boundary markers or herms, which look something like this. Whatever Wren had in mind, it's clear that these figures have only much more recently come to be called and understood as Roman emperors. In fact, so far as I've been able to discover, Beerbohm's novel in 1911 is the very first time they get called emperors in print, even if there was an oral tradition going back longer than that. Certainly now, if you go to Oxford, they are the emperors. They've become emperors. And that's why, actually, I'm starting with them, because we're going to be discovering today what a fluid category the 12 Caesars can be in later art and culture. My theme, to put it simply, is emperors in groups. Because over the past few weeks, I've looked mostly, not entirely, but mostly at individuals. Now I'm going to widen the focus and talk about the desire to represent emperors as a set, the desire to recreate visually Suetonius's 12 Caesars as he, writing in the 2nd century AD, canonized the first two imperial dynasties. And here, just to remind you, are the Caesars that we're dealing with. Because, curiously, we shall find that in those recreations, those visual recreations of Suetonius's set, 12 Caesars are not always 12, that even when they are 12, they're not always the same as Suetonius's 12. We'll also find that the Sheldonian heads are not the only example of completely innocent non-imperial faces that are retrospectively turned into 12 emperors. Now, we shan't today be looking at very many ancient Roman images. Romans did certainly exploit the idea of displaying portraits together, including some explicitly dynastic displays that serve to diagram the imperial family, its genealogy, and its potential heirs. One particularly striking example is on the screen now. This is just 6 of a group of originally 13 imperial statues, that's wives and wannabes and would-be heirs included, that all came from just one civic building in the small Italian town of Velleia. So you get these groups of emperors, but they're never just emperors. They've always got the Agrippinas in and whoever. What is more, we also know that Roman private collectors did look back to history and collected coherent groups of historical characters, literary and cultural giants of the past, from Homer to Herodotus, Sophocles to Socrates. The most over-the-top example of this is the so-called Villa of the Papyri from just outside Herculaneum, which was destroyed in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79, where a truly vast lineup of really classical poster heads had been discovered. Rows and rows of bronze portraits of renowned Greek kings, guru philosophers, copies of celebrity masterpieces, and so on. In fact, one of the things that for me makes Roman art of this period, the 1st century BC into the 1st century AD, so very interesting, is that it is actually the moment where in the ancient world we see the beginning of that culture of collecting that is rediscovered or reinvented in the Renaissance. Just as a nice capturing of that, here's Alma Tadema in the 19th century playing with the idea that Roman art buyers behave really much like modern 19th century art buyers. But I really put this on those of you who were here last time, because here, one of the pieces that they're looking at is the Agrippina from the Capitoline that we were looking at last 2 weeks ago. Anyway, we've got groups of statues, we have collecting of sets of statues. That said, there really is hardly a trace in Rome itself, either before or after Suetonius wrote, of any systematic attempt to visualize and represent in bronze or in marble past rulers as a group. Just the emperors, leaving out the women, the dead heirs, the didn't make it, and so forth. We don't get that idea of, here is my lineup of emperors. The closest we get is a hint that comes from a letter written in the 2nd century AD to the Emperor Trajan by a rich politician and landowner whom we now know as Pliny the Younger, to distinguish him from his uncle Pliny the Elder, who died in the eruption of Vesuvius. Pliny explains to the emperor that he has some statues of former emperors that he'd inherited through various bequests and kept on his estate. He then decided to sponsor the building of a temple in the local town and to transfer these statues there. And he's writing to Trajan to ask Trajan's permission to add a statue of him to this group. Trajan, actually, whose reply survives, Trajan replies with that appalling tone of mock modesty which good Roman emperors tend to adopt. He says, I really don't like honours of this kind. It's really frightfully over the top. I couldn't possibly, but just in this case, yes, you can, right? And always these kind of disclaimers, they always end up saying, but in this case, okay, right? Anyway, that's about the closest that we get to any reference to a Roman tradition of collecting portraits of reigning or reigned emperors. But even so, it's not exactly the same as what we're dealing with, because Pliny stresses that he hadn't systematically collected these, he just inherited them piecemeal, and they certainly weren't a fixed set, because he's wanting to add Trajan to it. And really, I think you might say that as a basic rule of thumb, anything that claims to be an ancient set of 12 Caesars is a forgery. Like, for example, this so-called Roman lamp, one of a set of 12 made, I think, in the 19th century. This is the Julius Caesar version. And even more suspiciously, here, the just near where the flame is, there is a 1. Right? I think completely gives it away as a forgery. I think it's not on display as a forgery in Mississippi Museum, but never mind. It was not, however, until the Renaissance that we find any systematic attempts to match up Suetonius's emperors, as he describes them in his biographies, to visual images. And that happened particularly, not entirely, but especially after the appearance of the first printed edition of Suetonius' Lives of the Emperors in 1470. From that period on, the idea of the 12 Caesars, les 12 Caesars, I 12 imperatores, and so forth, and the phrase is familiar in almost every European language. From that period on, the 12 Caesars have been one of the commonplaces, even the cliches of Western art. We find them grouped together, a series of busts in aristocratic houses and gardens all over the Western world. From Long Island to, that's in moonlight below, from Long Island to Ludwigslust. Now this lot actually in Germany were actually made of papier-mâché. Apparently you can just see them in the trees here in the trees. They're actually made of papier-mâché, and they lasted, it can't have rained very much in Ludwigslust, they lasted from 1760s to the Second World War. So we find them in busts and in gardens, we find them in prints, and engravings that were widely disseminated. If you couldn't get your 12 emperors in marble, you could at least get them on paper. It's a particularly nice set coming up, really sinister crowd. And there's Augustus. Yeah. They also appear on fountains. This is the emperors here. You see them slightly enlarged here. That's in Bolsover in England. And they line up in rather splendid ceramics, very wicked Caligula. They get reproduced in enamel, and they get reproduced in jewels to go round your head. Here is Pauline Bonaparte with, in this headdress, a set of Roman emperors. And you can find her wearing them again in this full-length portrait, and in a sense here there's a nice touch because she matches up, her headdress matches up with this bust, which is of course her brother Napoleon Bonaparte, but in the guise of a Roman emperor. They also, as we'll see later, form the inspiration of some fantastic silverware, even make it to the backs of chairs. Now, this is one of a group of 12 late 16th century German chairs. That's the front, but on the back, each one has a different Caesar on it. I assume that there was great fun in a sort of placement here, and you went to dinner and you weren't quite sure which Caesar chair you were going to, what did it say if you were given Caligula, right? Or worse, what if you got Vitellius? How would you ask for another helping if you're on the chair of the greatest glutton of history? So they get all over the place. But to go even further, go one step further, the Caesars have also left their mark on the ordering and classification of knowledge in a quite literal way. One of the most famous early libraries in England was the library of Sir Robert Cotton, who collected books and manuscripts at the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th centuries. And it's a collection that went on to form the nucleus of what is now the British Library. Cotton had arranged his library in a series of stacks of shelves, and on the top of each stack there stood an imperial bust. And those imperial busts became his classificatory scheme. So in the Cotton Library, Tiberius C2 meant the stack of books under the bust of Tiberius, 3 shelves down, 2 books along, which was in fact the Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history. Now, we know that this is how the collection was classified because it actually still is classified in that way, even in its present home in the British Library. The busts, sadly, have long disappeared. But if today you wanted to see, for example, the only surviving manuscript of that great Anglo-Saxon epic, Beowulf, you'd have to go to the British Library and order Cotton Vitellius A15. It always seems to me kind of rather more than Vitellius deserved, given what a nasty character. Nero gets the Lindisfarne Gospels. That seems even more unlikely. But all the same, it's a nice indication of how these emperors are not just museum objects, not just even visual objects, but kind of rooted in collective cultural memory and even in the classification of knowledge. Very funny, if you go and Google Vitellius, you will discover that an awful lot of references to Beowulf come up. But to return to the 12 Caesars, there is no doubt that many early collectors from the 15th century on were really keen on acquiring the Suetonius set from Julius Caesar through to Domitian. And if they had the money and the connections, they would try to do that with real, or more or less real, antiquities, acquiring them piece by piece until they got the lot. The Medici, for example, were doing that as early as the 1450s, and I suspect that it must be one of the factors that lies behind the many constructive misidentifications of these portraits that we've been following through this series. I mean, you have to imagine you've got 11 and all you need is a Caligula. The temptation for you or your contacts, or more especially your dealer, to see a Caligula in the next halfway plausible Roman bust that comes along must have been immense. And once that name got applied to these things, then of course, at least for a bit, it stuck. But not everyone could have their very own ancient set, and anyway, people sometimes wanted something rather different from just a lineup of marble busts. And so it was that the recreation of the canonical 12 Caesars in different forms became an artistic and a commercial driver for centuries. From the very top of the market, like this precious lapis lazuli plate, to more mass-produced objects that we've seen, like the little Limoges plaques or the sets of prints. And yet, like all systems of classification, the idea of the 12 Caesars proves to be less straightforward than it seems. Artists and patrons and collectors are not just slavishly following it, they're also adapting it, they are imaginatively responding to it, and they're sometimes even fighting against it. And it's also a category that is less stable and less unidirectional than we might imagine. True, of course, one big drive is to assemble the complete set of 12, but once assembled, we repeatedly find that intentionally or unintentionally, the 12 get split up and disaggregated with sometimes very curious results. And it's these adaptations and the disaggregations that I'm particularly interested in, as they can give you a fresh angle, I think, on some of the big issues that we've been looking at through this series. Let me give you a quick idea of what I mean. Take the basic ingredients: number, identity, and gender. That is, Suetonius's 12 male emperors from Julius Caesar to Domitian. Every single one of those ingredients gets constructively, sometimes subversively, adapted. Now, of course, to some extent, you don't have to group emperors in 12s. The people who planned that garden of emperors on Long Island were presumably always intending to have 18. And there was a rival Renaissance tradition, in fact, which offered a set of 24, and outbidding Suetonius by doubling him. But more often than not, it's the Suetonian 12 that forms the basic template, but repeatedly with adjustment, subversion, and difference. Robert Cotton's library, for example, certainly reflects that in going from Julius Caesar to Domitian as his library busts. But then Cotton adds 2 women, Cleopatra, the lover of Mark Antony and the defeated enemy of Augustus, Emperor number 2, and Faustina, the wife of the 2nd century AD Emperor Antoninus Pius. Now, almost certainly, there would have been practical reasons behind this adding in 2 women as extras. Presumably, Cotton had 14 stacks of shelves in his library and needed to add something to his 12 emperors. We might guess that he had 2 vaguely relevant female busts to hand. But the desire to introduce women into the lineup, or even to create an additional series of 12 canonical women, is something that we will come back to soon. I have to say we've got no idea what Cotton's Cleopatra looked like, but here I've given you a glimpse of another rather mixed imperial series from another house in England, which also introduces Cleopatra on the far left. The issues of choice in Raimondi's series of engravings of the 12 Caesars, though, is rather more puzzling. This was one of the most popular and influential versions of the Caesars from the 16th century on, and we've already had a look at this trio of them in Raimondi's version on the screen. Now look at the full lineup. It's not quite as simply Suetonian as you might think. For as the gap I put in there indicates, Raimondi misses out Caligula and instead includes Trajan, the next emperor but one after the death of Domitian. We have no idea why he did that. I think it's hard to imagine, as some modern critics have supposed, that he just got confused. That he was illustrating Suetonius. The idea he didn't know that Caligula was supposed to be there, not Trajan, seems to me very unlikely. To be nice to think that Raimondi's choice actually reflects back onto a question I raised in an earlier lecture, namely how far the monstrous immorality of these characters was still a live issue in their images. Could it be, for example, that Raimondi decided to swap the good Trajan in for the very bad Caligula? And I think that is quite a nice idea, but if that is the case, it's hard to understand why he left in Nero and Vitellius, and indeed most of the others too. So it's not wholly certain what's going on here. But shifts and disruptions to this pattern of 12 come in other forms. As we saw happening with the Sheldonian emperors, the category has a marvellous tendency to expand and sort of to apply its name to any group of more or less 12 figures that you like. I mean, just like the emperors were rather expansionist, so the category of 12 is a very expansionist category. And groups of portraits become redefined as Caesars when they really can't have started out like that at all. Sometimes that redefinition happened centuries ago, and it's given us some of our most famous emperor groups. Now, I've shown you several views of these tremendous late 15th, early 16th century emperors at Hampton Court. Now I have to confess that they almost certainly were not originally intended to be Roman emperors. In fact, they weren't originally all made for Hampton Court at all, but they got moved there. They appear to have got named as emperors sometime in the 17th century, and so they became, at that point, the Hampton Court emperors, and then later in the 19th century, some of them got named as such with a little plaque under them too. Now, we can't now unthink them as Roman emperors. These are the Hampton Court emperors. Nevertheless, there is no suggestion, no clear suggestion, that that is what they were designed to be. But redefinition like that can also be the work of modern scholarship too. In a story that will be partly familiar to you by now, this marvellous piece of 15th century sculpture is first referred to in the 16th century as the ancient Greek lawgiver Solon. It is then later, surprise, surprise, re-identified as Julius Caesar, but then, on very little firm evidence indeed, it is assumed to be the first of a lost series of the 12 Suetonian emperors. And indeed, some pretty ingenious scholarship at the end of the last century has set about to reconstruct what the others might have looked like. You'll see instantly the irony here. First, you see Julius Caesar in this piece, which it may not be, but that then in turn leads you to invent a whole series of 11 more to go with him. But I want, for the rest of the time this afternoon, to explore just 2 examples of this in rather more detail. First of all, Titian's 11 Caesars that he painted for the ducal palace in Mantua in the 1530s, and the silver emperor bowls that we saw on screen a little while ago, which were probably made a little bit later in the 1560s. Together, these 2 examples, I think, show just how flexible and dynamic and productive a category the 12 Caesars and thinking about the 12 Caesars can be. They also, though, give us some quite interesting hints about how Suetonius as a collection of biographies was read and interpreted in the 16th century, and it's rather differently from how we interpret him today. And they offer, of course, and you'll be expecting this, a few more examples of creative misidentification, which, in this case, bring a salutary lesson for modern museum practice. Now, I'm going to start with Mantua, and I should say that I realise that being a mere classicist and delving into Titian is a very hubristic and dangerous thing to do, but I'm going to have a go nevertheless. Helped in part because Titian's paintings of the Caesars don't actually survive. Makes it easier for me to talk about them. They were sold from Mantua to Charles I of England as a series in 1627, and after his execution they were again sold, and they ended up in Spain, where they were completely and utterly destroyed in a fire in 1734. They were, however, so popular that there were many copies of them made, both some not particularly distinguished painted versions, and this set of engravings, which are generally assumed to be the best guide to their original appearance. The current state of the room in which they were originally displayed in Mantua is honestly, I think, a bit disappointing. This is a rather clumsy restoration with copies of pictures of the Caesars at roughly the original level at which they would have been displayed, but certainly not necessarily in the right position, and it also completely fails to capture the splendour and the complexity of the original design. For Titian collaborated in the decoration of the room with Giulio Romano, who painted, among other things, a series of scenes drawn from the lives of the emperors, one scene to go with each single emperor. It's possible to go some way towards reimagining what the room might have looked like, thanks in part to early inventories of the Mantua collection, thanks also to sketches of parts of the original installations, which we have. And there are also, as we shall see, a few surviving pieces of Giulio Romano's work and copies of others, which might help to recapture something of the original display. But even so, it is still far from certain exactly what went where in this room. But I'm going to concentrate on the more or less certain elements. There can be no doubt at all that Titian's Nero, who you see here on the left, was accompanied by this surviving painting by Giulio Romano, showing the fire of Rome, with Nero playing the lyre up here while Rome burns. So Nero's fiddling while Rome burns, all hell is breaking out here, and there's the fire. Meanwhile, Claudius must have gone with this painting, which shows a strange omen predicting Claudius's rise to power. On one occasion it said Claudius entered the forum at Rome, and suddenly an eagle, which was the symbol of empire, landed on his shoulders, from which it was clear that although he was a bit of a dodgerer who wasn't really in the main line of succession, it showed that one day he would be emperor. And here is Claudius, and here's his great black eagle on his shoulder. Tiberius had this emblematic scene, seen here in a drawing. It's a strange story. It's a story of the modesty. It's called the modesty of Tiberius. What is going on is that Tiberius, who's at this point a young man, really hates flattery. Tiberius can't bear flattery. So that when an elderly Roman here comes up to him to apologise for something that he's done and tries to grab Tiberius's knees in a classic Roman gesture of submission, Tiberius is so horrified by this gesture by this old man that he draws back so sharply that he falls over. So there's Tiberius falling over in order to avoid having his knees grasped by this guy. It's not a very well-known story. Augustus went with a painting which you here see in an engraved version, and it's another sign of future greatness. The story went that one day when Augustus was a baby, he was left to sleep on the ground by his nurses. When his nurses came back in the morning, they couldn't find him. And terrible panic, empty cradle. Oh my God, what's happened? Actually, Augustus has miraculously been transferred to the top of a nearby tower where he is facing the sun, and here is Apollo steaming in to be the sun, to show that Augustus, in due course, will both be a herald of light, semi-divine, and particularly associated with Apollo. Now, one thing is absolutely certain from those four scenes which we can really tie in, I think, to individual emperors. One thing is absolutely certain. That is, Giulio Romano is directly drawing these rather strange anecdotes from Suetonius. All the stories that we've just looked at are found in Suetonius' Lives, and some of them are found only in Suetonius' Lives. You can't have been getting them anywhere else. There are, I suppose I should confess, one or two scenes that are still a bit of a puzzle, like this one, seen both in a painting in Hampton Court, but also a drawing here in the National Gallery. It appears to be a sacrifice of a goat, and I think it must come from Suetonius somewhere, but I haven't been able to nail it. One suggestion has linked it to a passage and an incident in Suetonius' Life of Domitian, but it doesn't really match up to that. But anyway, it couldn't possibly be right, because there's cast iron documentary evidence that there was no scene of Domitian and no portrait of Domitian in this room. There were only 11 Caesar portraits, starting with Julius and ending with Titus, omitting the last Caesar of the Second Dynasty, the monstrous guy Domitian, who was assassinated in 96. So how does one square this? It is, I think, at first sight pretty puzzling, because we've got a room whose decoration, the iconography of the decoration, closely reflects the text and the vision of Suetonius in depicting these emperors, except in the single most distinctive aspect of Suetonius, that is the number of the emperors. We've got 11, not 12. The usual answer, I have to say, I think is pretty feeble. apologise here. Actually, this is where it's hubristic getting involved in Titian, because I'm about to say that people have, great expert on Titian have got this wrong. The answer I have found is people say, well, look, the room was terribly small, and the fireplace was in a frightfully inconvenient place, as were the windows and doors. Poor old Titian couldn't fit all 12 in, right? Now, this is kind of ludicrous, it seems to me. The idea that, Titian comes along and there he is, everything's going fine, and he's got all this stuff, and he thinks, oh, God, I can't fit Domitian in, just have to be 11, never mind, Titian was quite good at the manipulation of space, and if he only put 11 Caesars, he meant only to have 11 Caesars. Now, I'm not quite sure what I think the answer is, but my hunch is that this room is saying something about not only succession, but also somehow about the incompleteness of dynasty. You may already have noticed how several of these Julio-Romano scenes focus on the transmission of power or the presage of future greatness. I think that fits in a way with the omission of Domitian. So I think what we're seeing here, or one of the ways of reading what we're seeing here, is to see it as a representation of dynasty in progress. This is dynasty which has not yet come to the end. We're going to leave Domitian out because it is not a closed set. This is still a dynasty which has got a future. I quite like that idea, but I don't think people at the time did, or at least if Titian and his collaborators were making that kind of point, the drive to display the full set of 12 soon overcame it, because in 1562, in about 30 years, Bernardino Campi made a matching Domitian, of course, that couldn't be fitted into the room, but was displayed next door to make up the set. And ever since, it has, I'm afraid, only been real pedants who refer to Titian's 11 Caesars. Most people, including, I regret to say, some art historians, have assumed that Titian did 12, but he didn't. Now, there's an excuse for that, because it's partly, I think, because when Gideon Sadler, the main engraver, made those engravings that we saw, he included Campi's Domitian as part of the set. And it was these engravings that launched the Mantuan emperors into a whole new phase of life, no matter whether the original paintings survived or not, or where they were. Long after the originals had gone up in smoke, these copies were themselves being copied and recopied in all kinds of different media. And you find them all over the place. Here is a nice little bronze medallion of Caligula that I found completely unrecognised in a country auction outside Cambridge just the weekend before I came to Washington. And you'll see instantly where it comes from. There is Sadler's engraving of Titian's Caligula, and what this medallion has done is taken that and turned it into a bronze. So you get copies in all sorts of forms. You get paintings that are based not on Titian's paintings, but on the prints and so on. But also, these engravings by Sadler actively re-signified those Titian images too. Here's Tiberius. Now, for a start, what Sadler does when he makes the engravings is include Latin verses underneath each emperor, Latin verses which really prompt the viewer to a particular response, and often, I think, to a response that is significantly different from what Giulio Romano's image prompted you to. Because this Tiberius here is not the man of modesty that Giulio Romano captured, falling back rather than have some elderly Roman grasp his knees, but in some pretty atrocious Latin. And I think when classicists say in pretty atrocious Latin, what they mean is in Latin that they find very difficult to understand, so therefore bad Latin, because we can understand it as good Latin, in some pretty atrocious Latin, which is partly a pastiche of different sections of Suetonius. This Tiberius is the cruel tyrant whose death brought joy to his people. Now, so you've got not only a change of media, but you have here a change of a push in a different direction to how we might see these individual characters. But more than that, Sadler also completely invented, a matching set of 12 imperial women, giving one wife to each emperor. Now, Titian never painted these imperial women, but you get Sadler's series in 2 runs. One, the emperors based on Titian plus Campus Domitian, and 2, some entirely fictional, as it were, not fictional, real empresses, but entirely out of his own head. Given what we were talking about last time, I thought what I would put on screen here on the left is Sadler's version of Tiberius's first wife. Now, I remember I ended last time saying how we call Tiberius's first wife Vipsania, but she was equally well and more usually known as Agrippina. And I remember saying how that painting, that famous Rubens here, could really well be a picture of Tiberius and this Agrippina. Here you see Tiberius's first wife. It says here, the wife of Tiberius, and she is called Agrippina. And underneath in these verses, again, quite hard to understand, although Tiberius in the matching set is a monster, here what Agrippina is doing is saying how much she loves Tiberius despite the fact that they were made to divorce. So it makes a nice match with the Rubens of last time. And I think in general there's a wonderful story here, starting with Titian but moving out through different media, into print, into metal, back into painting, inventing new series, adjusting it through the centuries, telling you different ways to think about it. That really does, in a sense, encapsulate some of the things we've been looking at in this series. And for me, is a wonderful kind of sensitizing device to how ancient imagery might work too. When we're looking at the ancient world, we're looking at how images of emperors get transmitted and how they get recognized. We miss out an awful lot because basically we've only got bronze and marble. If we thought of paper and paint and the different ways that images come in and out of different media, I think we might have a better way of understanding how these things in antiquity itself get spread, really, across the whole of the Mediterranean world. So they're very nice, but they also link up with what I'm going to go on to talk about, which is my final example. And they are some of my very, very favourite things. What they are, and I haven't got all 12 on screen because they would be so tiny, they are 12 16th century silver gilt cups, or tazze, each with the standing figure of a named emperor from Julius Caesar to Domitian in the centre. One of the key things you have to remember is the emperors are named. You can just see here on the bottom, Galba. And round on the bowl surrounding the emperors are 4 scenes from that emperor's life, chased in the silver gilt. Now, these objects are known as the Aldobrandini tazze because they were at some point the property of the Italian Aldobrandini family, or at least some of them were, as we can tell from the fact that 6 of them have got the Aldobrandini coat of arms pricked onto them. We don't know who they were originally made for, or exactly when they were made, or by whom, or what the process of design was, or where they were made. Some people have thought Italy, others further north, Germany, and I'll come back to that. Now, in pretty much every case, the scenes that are chased into the bowls around the emperors, I suppose I should have said, we don't also know what they were for, frankly. We call them tazze cups, bowls. People differ very much whether they were simply display pieces, cabinet pieces, tableware, putting the grapes in, I think, would be quite good. in pretty much every case anyway, the scenes on the bowls around the emperors come directly from Suetonius's biography of the emperor concerned, and they're very, very distinct overlaps with what we saw at Mantua. Here, you have to get your eye in with this, here is the fire of Rome. Here's the flames. Here's Rome going up in flames, and here, in the top left, is Nero playing his lyre while the city burns. Here is Claudius in the forum, and the eagle has just landed on his shoulder. It's exactly the same as the Julia Romano piece. In fact, again, we find quite a definite emphasis in these scenes on the bowls, on the presages of power. Here, in one of 4 remarkably sanitized scenes from the life of Vitellius, here's 2 battalions of the army. Here's the army all marching. They're all marching to Italy. And here is an eagle leading the way and predicting, effectively a prediction of Vitellius's rise to power. There you can see the eagle. It's a nice, nasty bird. They're going to victory. I have to say that in another scene on the same Vitellius bowl, we've got another bird, and this is a rooster landing on Vitellius's shoulder while he's giving legal judgment. And this actually is a less happy sign. The eagle was a good sign. It was showing that Vitellius was going to win. This is a much less happy sign because in the end, Vitellius was actually finally done to death by a man whose nickname was Becco, which is the Latin for rooster's beak. So this is a prediction of Vitellius's end, not his success. Although, if you can tell a rooster from an eagle, it's on these bowls, you're better than me. Now, all those scenes are taken absolutely to the letter from Suetonius's texts, just like we've seen before. But also, just like before, they are not, certainly for us, the most memorable or famous scenes from the biographies of Suetonius. I had to go and I couldn't have any recollection of this scene of the rooster landing on Vitellius's shoulder. Nor, I think, unless you happen to be a bird lover, are they the most visually appealing scenes that you might get out of Suetonius. Some are quite good. The Fire of Rome, obviously, is jolly good. But all these eagles and roosters, they're not very gripping. In fact, as with what we saw at Mantua, we've got a selection here of scenes which tend to prioritize issues of succession and the pattern of dynasty and the presages of power. Now, I know that this might seem like a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I do think that issues of succession underlie what the people who are making these images are interested in. They're interested in how people come to power and how you know who is going to be in power. And I think that's a better argument to think about these images with than the other version, which I have to say is that people have tried to explain these choices as saying the Renaissance are frightfully superstitious, so they'll always illustrate the omens because they're kind of superstitious guys. And I think it goes much beyond that. This is about how you know who is going to be emperor. That is what is key. And I think, to go back to what I was saying I would comment on before, I think they also suggest that Renaissance readers, when they read Suetonius, saw in him significantly different things from what we see. We tend, I have to say, to treat Suetonius' lives as if they were series of individual books. That is, we read the life of Nero on its own or the life of Vitellius. We don't put them together. Readers in the Renaissance, who I suspect read Latin much more quickly than we do, approach them much more as if they were 12 chapters of a single book. And so they picked up these hints, which run right through the series, that we tend to miss, that Suetonius was not just writing about individual emperors, but he was writing about dynastic succession. And in that way, I think they were kind of better readers of Suetonius than we are. Interestingly, when I was doing a graduate seminar in Berkeley a couple of years ago with a group of very bright Berkeley undergraduates, I made them go away and read Suetonius in English, cover to cover, and come back and say what they thought, what difference it made just to read the whole lot. And they instantly said, you see that this book is about dynasty. It's not just about emperors. I think this is what was seen in the 16th century. So far, so good. We've got very clear parallels between what Mantua is putting on its walls and what these guys are putting on their tazze. But the truth is that these 12 wonderful objects have had a very checkered history. And in a magnificent or perhaps horrifying example of disaggregation and separation, the original 12 tazze have ended up in ones and twos all over the Western world, from California to Lisbon, Toronto to Madrid, and London to New York. How come? Well, the fact is that these tazze, as a group, passed through various different hands after they'd been owned at some point by the Aldobrandini until 1861. That is when the last time anybody ever saw them together, all in one place, on sale at Christie's in London. When they next resurface, they have all been gilded, because it doesn't seem that they were gilded before. It looks as if they were plain silver, at least in the 1861 sale catalogue. They're in the plain silver category, they're not in the gilded silver category. And some of them have had their relatively tasteful stems replaced by these 6. So 6 of them no longer have these stems, they've got these stems. It is believed that these stems were melted down to make these. And even worse in a way, one bowl that showed the scenes from the life of Titus, has been replaced in the tazze by a copy, and the original bowl has been sold off separately as a rosewater dish. Now, the villain of the piece here is usually taken to be the Austrian art dealer Friedrich Spitzer, who at some time after 1861 seems to have owned 11 of them and is assumed to have improved them in order to up their value. I think there are still puzzles. If he only owned 11, he can't be him that was responsible for the gilding, and it's not quite clear why he only changed the stems of 6, but never mind. By the late 19th century, thanks to Spitzer, these pieces are on their way to separate sales in separate homes across Europe and America. But that's only part of the puzzle. There are 2 other intriguing difficulties. The first is that these objects come to pieces. The emperors just unscrew. And everyone, for the last 100 years or so, has been quite well aware that the wrong figures, which are all named, remember, have been connected to the wrong bowls, which aren't. Now, I don't think that we have necessarily to blame Spitzer for this, because I imagine the first time the cleaning lady unscrewed them to clean them in the late 16th century, she didn't know how the hell to put them back together again. And I suspect that the Aldobrandini or whoever didn't know which went with which either. So, wrong emperors, wrong bowls. Secondly, there's been a long history of the misidentification of the scenes on the bowls going back at least to the 19th century and probably before, which makes it even more difficult to match up figure and bowl. Now, it's an intriguing story, which I think I can best explain to you if I tell it to you in a shamelessly autobiographical way, focusing on my own recent encounters with just a couple of these bowls. Encounters, I should say, which I've been greatly helped by a fellow fan of these objects, partner in crime, Tim Schroeder. Now, this story starts in January when I went to see the tazze, which is now in the V&A in London, which, according to all accounts of it, in every museum label and every discussion going back to Spitzer's catalogue, was supposed to show 4 scenes from the life of the Emperor Domitian. Domitian's wife going to see him in Germany, Domitian fighting the Dacians, Domitian's triumphal procession, and Domitian receiving the submission of Germany. The first scene which didn't look right was the triumphal procession. It certainly was a Roman triumphal procession. Here's the chariot. And Domitian certainly had celebrated a triumph. But this general was doing something very strange. You see here, he's got out of the chariot and he's on his knees in front of this person here, who looks much like the emperor. That is not what Roman generals are supposed to do, and it's certainly not what Roman emperors are supposed to do. Then I remembered a story in a quite different life. When Suetonius is describing the triumphal procession of Tiberius before he became emperor himself, Suetonius says this: "As he turned to enter the capital, he dismounted from his chariot and fell at the knees of Augustus, who was presiding over the ceremonies," which must be what is going on here. So what about the other scenes on the Domitian bowl? Well, this scene, cart here, is supposed to be Domitian's wife going to join him in Germany. But if you look, there are flames all around. It's like the fire of Rome. There's flames all around. And the lady, there's lots of horrible flames here, and the lady is carrying what looks like a baby. Now, Domitian and his wife did have a child, but this kid had died years before Domitian's German wars. The problem is again solved by turning to the life of Tiberius, where Suetonius explains that Livia, Tiberius's mum, took the young Tiberius everywhere with her. On one occasion, he says, he almost lost his life when the woods suddenly took fire all about them, and the flames so encircled the whole company that part of Livia's robe and her hair were scorched. That, I suggest, is what is happening here. In other words, by simply referring back to Suetonius, we can see very clearly, as no one else appears to have done for about 150 years, that this bowl is the Tiberius bowl, not the Domitian bowl. And other things obviously follow from that. For a start, if you get the identification right, it can help with the question of where these things were made. Now, people have often noticed in the middle of a battle scene these little standards with pine cones on them. It's on this dish, and they've pointed out that the pine cone symbol is a symbol of the town of Augsburg, which was a well-known centre for silver production. What they haven't spotted, because they didn't think it was a Tiberius bowl, is a specifically Tiberius connection. According to Suetonius, Tiberius defeated the tribe of the Vitellici, and then he founded on their territory the town of Augusta Vindelicorum, which became modern Augsburg. This seems to me to make it absolutely certain that the centre of production for these bowls is Augsburg. That is to say, this is the battle, and there, over there, are the little pine cones. What we've got in representing the battle between the Vindelici and Tiberius forces, the makers have written the backstory of their own town into the bowls. But there's also, so we could forget that it was made in Italy by Benvenuto Cellini, which is the other possibility. Benvenuto Cellini did not know about this. There's also a knock-on effect. If this bowl here isn't Domitian but Tiberius, what then is the Tazza in Lisbon, which is supposed to show the scenes of the life of Tiberius? Well, people have been on the chase with this before, because the word Domitian is actually scratched into the bowl in Lisbon, which was, I have to say, a good try, but it was wrong. It has to be Caligula, who is here seen prancing across the bridge of boats, which Suetonius claims he built across the Bay of Naples. And if that's Caligula, then what about the one in Minneapolis that is always said to be Caligula? Well, that one has got to be Domitian, because here is a very famous moment in the life of Domitian in Suetonius, the burning of the Capitoline Hill at Rome, much to the danger of the young Domitian at the very beginning of his father's reign. You can see now, I think, why I like these objects so much. They're a marvellous example of a close visual reading of Suetonius, yet they're at the same time a classic example of the kind of slippage and reinterpretations of scenes and identities that we've seen all the way through this series. And yet also they teach us that it is really worth trying to get it right, because as that story about Augsburg shows, if you get the identification right, if you bother to pick up the Suetonius, you can say something important also about the material history of the objects. But to finish, there's a nasty sting in the tail, which reinforces that point. By the 1950s, the museum collections where several of these pieces had ended up were beginning to feel that it was a terrible pity that the wrong emperors were attached to the wrong bowls. And as they were so easy to unscrew, why not just swap the emperors? So an ambitious and generous, very generous, three-cornered swap was arranged between the Met, the Royal Ontario Museum, and the V&A. The V&A ended up with the Domitian figure from Ontario, which was all jolly nice, and it was supposed to match the Domitian bowl that they had. The problem was they'd not at that point realised that they didn't have the Domitian bowl, they actually had the Tiberius bowl. So the generous swap only succeeded in making things worse. Thank you very much.